The cowboy noticed the stranger just before dusk. When the sun hung low and red over, the plains and the wind carried the smell of dust and dry grass. He had been fixing a loose board on the corral fence, his hands rough and aching, when something caught his eye near the far edge of his land. At first, he thought it was a fallen animal. Out here, death was common enough that it barely surprised him anymore. But then the shape shifted, slowly, painfully, and he realized it was a man. The cowboy straightened, narrowing his eyes. Strangers were rare this far from town, and when they did appear, they usually brought trouble with them. He rested a hand on his belt, not on the gun yet, but close enough to feel its familiar weight. The man near the fence tried to stand and failed, sinking back into the dirt, like his strength had already been spent elsewhere. Against his better judgment, the cowboy walked closer. The man was native, that much was clear. His clothes were torn and caked with dust, his moccasins worn thin, the leather cracked from miles of walking. His face was gaunt, cheeks hollow, lips dry and split. Yet his eyes, dark and steady, followed the cowboy's every move, sharp despite the weakness in his body. There was pride in that gaze, and something else too. Resolve, the kind that didn't break easily. "You lost?" the cowboy asked, keeping his voice even. The man swallowed hard. "Hungry," he said quietly. His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in days. The cowboy hesitated. He thought of the stories whispered in town. Raids, ambushes, revenge. He thought of how alone his ranch was, miles from help. And he thought of his own pantry, already thin. The winter coming faster than it should. Helping this man meant risk. It meant less food. It meant inviting the unknown onto his land. Still, he saw no weapon on the stranger. No horse, no sign of deceit. Just a man who looked one step away from death. "Come on," the cowboy muttered, more to himself than to the stranger. He offered an arm. The man accepted it without hesitation, though his grip trembled with exhaustion. Each step toward the barn was slow. The man leaned heavily on him, breath shallow, boots dragging through the dirt. Up close, the cowboy could smell sweat and dust and hunger, an emptiness so deep it felt almost like a sound. Inside the barn, the light was dim and warm. The cowboy guided the man to a crate and sat him down. He poured water from his canteen and handed it over. The man drank carefully, not gulping, as if he knew how dangerous desperation could be. When he finished, he bowed his head slightly in thanks. "Food," the cowboy said. "Ain't much." He brought out what he had, a small pot of beans left from the night before, a piece of dry bread, and a bit of salted meat he'd been saving. He set it down without ceremony, then stepped back, giving the man space. The stranger ate slowly, deliberately. Each bite was chewed as if it mattered, as if wasting even a crumb would be an insult. He didn't speak while he ate, didn't look up, but the tension in his shoulders slowly eased. Color returned to his face, little by little, like life itself was remembering how to stay. The cowboy watched quietly. He told himself he was just being cautious, but the truth was, something about the man held his attention. There was dignity in the way he sat, even half-starved and broken. No begging, no gratitude spoken too loudly, just quiet endurance. When the food was gone, the man wiped his hands on his sleeve and placed one hand over his heart. "My name is Red Hawk," he said. "You saved my life." The cowboy shrugged, uncomfortable with the weight of the words. "Just food," he replied. "Didn't save nothing." Red Hawk shook his head slowly. "You shared what you had. That is not nothing." For a moment they sat in silence. Outside, the wind rustled through the grass, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out. The cowboy leaned against a post, studying the man more closely now. He could see old scars along his arms, faint but many. This was not someone unfamiliar with hardship or with fighting. "You travel alone?" the cowboy asked. "Yes," Red Hawk answered. "For now?" The cowboy nodded. He wanted to ask more, where he came from, why he was here, what had driven him so close to death, but something told him not to push. Some stories were given only when the time was right. Red Hawk stood, testing his strength. Though still weak, he was steadier now. He met the cowboy's eyes, his expression serious. "My people believe a debt of life is the greatest debt," he said. "It cannot be ignored." The cowboy frowned. "You don't owe me anything. Red Hawk's lips curved into the faintest smile. "That is for my people to decide." He turned toward the barn door. Before stepping out, he paused and looked back. "Kindness travels faster than fear," he said softly. Then he stepped into the fading light. The cowboy followed him outside, but the man was already moving away, his steps quiet despite his condition. Within moments, Red Hawk blended into the land itself, disappearing into the tall grass and shadows as if he had never been there at all. The cowboy stood alone in the yard, the sky darkening above him. A strange unease settled in his chest. Not regret, exactly, but a sense that something had been set in motion. He didn't know if he'd just done the smartest thing of his life or the most dangerous. He glanced back at his barn, at the empty pot, at the quiet land stretching out in every direction. "All I did was feed a hungry man," he muttered. But deep down, he had the feeling that the plains had taken note, and they rarely forgot. The sound came before the sight. A low vibration rolled through the ground, subtle at first, like distant thunder that didn't belong to the sky. The cowboy woke with a jolt, instincts sharp before his thoughts caught up. He sat up on his narrow bed, listening. The barn was still dark, the early morning cold seeping through the wooden walls, but the vibration was real. The lantern hanging by the door swayed ever so slightly. His hand went to his rifle. He stepped outside, just as the first grey light of dawn spread across the plains. That was when he saw them. They stood beyond the fence line at first, stretching across the land in a wide arc that seemed to have no end. Horses, dozens, no, hundreds. Tall, strong animals shifting their weight, their breath rising in pale clouds. Mounted on them were native warriors, silent and unmoving, their presence so complete it felt as though the land itself had summoned them. The cowboy's heart slammed against his ribs. 200 warriors faced his barn, lined with precision and calm. Feathers stirred in the breeze. Leather creaked softly. Spears, bows, and shields caught the early sunlight, but not a single weapon was raised. Still, the sheer number of them made his mouth go dry. He was one man with a rifle and a revolver, standing on open ground with nowhere to hide. He raised the rifle anyway, more from reflex than confidence. The horses stopped as one. From the center of the line, a rider moved forward. The cowboy recognized him instantly, even from a distance. The same steady posture, the same dark eyes. Red Hawk. The warrior dismounted slowly, deliberately, showing empty hands. He stepped forward until he stood just a few yards away, then lifted his right hand. Behind him, the warriors remained still, watching. "Lower your weapon," Red Hawk said calmly. His voice carried without effort. The cowboy hesitated. Every lesson he'd ever learned screamed at him not to trust this moment. But something in Red Hawk's tone, steady, controlled, respectful, cut through the fear. Slowly, he lowered the rifle until its barrel pointed at the ground. Red Hawk nodded once. He turned back to the line and spoke in his own language. The words rolled like water over stone, firm, rhythmic, filled with purpose. When he finished, he knelt. The movement struck the cowboy harder than any threat could have. Red Hawk knelt in the dirt before him, head bowed. A murmur rippled through the line. Then one by one, the warriors dismounted. 200 men placed their feet on the ground and followed Red Hawk's example. They knelt in silence, their heads lowered in unison. The cowboy's hands began to shake. Red Hawk rose and faced him again. "This man," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the field, "found me starving on his land. He did not ask who I was. He did not ask what trouble I might bring. He fed me when he had little and gave me water when I could no longer stand." Red Hawk paused, letting the words settle. "He showed honor," he continued, "where fear would have been easier." The cowboy swallowed. He wanted to protest, to say it wasn't like that he'd only done what any man should. But his throat refused to cooperate. Red Hawk gestured toward the kneeling warriors. "These are my people. They stand here not to threaten, but to witness." He stepped closer to the cowboy. "A life saved creates a bond stronger than blood. From this day forward, your land is under our protection." The cowboy stared at him, struggling to understand. "Protection," he echoed. Red Hawk nodded. "No raider will cross your fence. No thief will steal your cattle. No enemy will harm you here. If danger comes, it will answer to us first. The cowboy felt a tightness in his chest he couldn't name. He had lived alone for so long that the idea of anyone standing for him, let alone 200 warriors, felt unreal. Red Hawk turned again and raised his hand. The warriors stood as one, fluid and silent. He spoke again in his language, this time shorter, sharper. The warriors struck the ground once with their weapons, not in threat, but in promise. The sound echoed across the plains like a vow. The cowboy lowered his head, overwhelmed. "I didn't help you for this," he said quietly. Red Hawk met his gaze. "That is why it matters." For a moment, the two men simply stood there, one a lone rancher, the other a leader of warriors, connected by a single act of kindness. Neither had planned. Red Hawk mounted his horse. Before leaving, he leaned down slightly. "If you ever need us," he said, "light a fire on that hill." He pointed to a rise overlooking the land. "We will see it." The warriors turned their horses as one, forming a long, flowing line. Slowly, they began to move away, hooves beating a steady rhythm into the earth. Dust rose behind them, golden in the morning light. The cowboy stood there long after they were gone, the plains quiet once more. The fence still stood. The barn still creaked in the wind. Yet everything felt different. He looked down at his hands that had once thought kindness was a weakness out here. He understood now how wrong he'd been. Out on the open plains, where survival ruled and fear traveled fast, respect traveled farther. And it always came back.